The stars were my only comfort in the vast, silent night. But then, one by one, they vanished, leaving the sky in total darkness. That's when I felt it, a presence watching me, closing in. Something I couldn't explain but knew wasn't human. I came here to escape the noise, the emails, the endless gray of life. The wilderness seemed perfect, pure air, towering pines, and a sky so clear it felt like a promise. But that promise betrayed me. It started slow. One star, then another, winked out as I sat by the fire. Clouds, I muttered, but no clouds came. The stars just disappeared into nothingness. My heart quickened as the last one vanished, leaving the sky impossibly empty. I stared upward, suffocated by the void. Then I heard it, a faint rustle, followed by the deliberate crunch of leaves. My skin prickled as if the night itself was holding its breath. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but the beam sliced through empty space. My fire flickered, dimming to coals despite having been roaring just moments earlier. Video. Hello, my voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. No answer. My breath fogged in the air. It wasn't cold before, but now the chill crept into my bones. Something shifted behind me. I spun, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. But nothing moved. Just shadows that seemed too still, too dense. I backed toward the fire, my heart hammering. That's when I noticed the smell, sharp, metallic, like copper pennies warmed in the sun. It clung to the air, sour and wrong. And the stars, they didn't return. I barely slept that night, the oppressive darkness pressing against my tent like a physical weight. When morning finally broke, it came sluggishly, the sun struggling to penetrate the canopy. Silence was unnerving. No birds chirping, no rustling wind, just stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I stepped outside, my boots crunching the frost-dusted ground. The fire pit was cold, though I distinctly remembered stoking the flames before crawling into my sleeping bag. My flashlight lay where I'd dropped it, the bulb flickering weakly. As I stretched, I caught sight of something odd, a tree about 10 yards from my tent. Its bark was carved with a strange symbol, a spiraling pattern that seemed almost alive. It hadn't been there yesterday. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I shook it off. Maybe I'd just missed it. Maybe someone else had camped here before me. Rational explanations were comforting, but they didn't explain the unease prickling the back of my neck. I pulled out my journal, jotting down my thoughts. Weird night. Stars vanished. Strange carving. Probably nothing. As the pen scratched the page, I noticed my watch. It was frozen at 3:12. No matter how much I fiddled with it, the hands wouldn't budge. Then I noticed something more chilling. My journal, pristine when I opened it, now had an unfamiliar message scrawled across the last page. You're not alone. My phone was dead. It was fine yesterday, fully charged when I arrived, but now it wouldn't even power on. My watch still hadn't moved. Something wasn't right. The forest felt different, denser, darker, even in daylight. I decided to hike back the way I came, convinced I just needed to shake off the weirdness. But as I walked, the trail twisted and shifted. Trees I swore I recognized were suddenly unfamiliar. Every step forward seemed to lead me back to where I started. The silence followed me, oppressive and unnatural. Then came the objects. At first I thought they were just debris, a rusted knife lying half buried in the dirt, the handle worn smooth by time. I picked it up, a chill racing up my arm, before tossing it away. Next, a child's shoe, small, muddy, and damp. It looked freshly dropped, as if its owner had just passed through. But no one else should have been out here. The worst came later. A Polaroid photograph fluttered down the trail. I almost didn't pick it up. But curiosity won. My hands trembled as I turned it over. It was me, sleeping in my tent. My stomach twisted, my pulse hammering in my ears. I spun in place, scanning the trees, the trail, the shadows, but nothing moved. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't alone last night. I stumbled into a clearing, sweat slicking my skin despite the cold. At its center was an abandoned campsite. For a moment, I thought I'd found someone else, a hiker or ranger. But as I approached, my blood turned to ice. It wasn't just any campsite, it was mine. The tent was identical, down to the frayed corner of the canvas. The lantern, tipped on its side, was the same one I'd packed. Even the journal on the ground was mine. My handwriting stared back at me from the pages they're coming. I felt my knees weaken as I read the words. The air around me seemed heavier, charged with something unseen. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its posture too still. It didn't move. It didn't speak. I tried to call out, but my throat tightened, my voice strangled by fear. In the time it took me to blink, the figure was gone. Just gone. I staggered forward, desperate to leave, but stopped dead when I noticed a new carving in a nearby tree, a spiral, pulsating faintly as if alive. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard the whisper again, low and guttural, as if spoken directly into my ear. You can't leave. I stared at the black sky above, my breath fogging in the unnatural chill. The darkness was different, thick, heavy, alive. It felt like something unseen loomed just out of reach, watching, waiting. The whispers came again, louder this time. Not random murmurs, but deliberate words, low and guttural, spoken in a voice that scraped against my sanity. Elliot, why did you come here? I froze. My name, spoken as if by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. The voice was layered, overlapping itself in a haunting echo. It started listing my regrets, things I'd buried. So deep even I rarely thought about them. My chest tightened as it spat out my worst failures. My most shameful secrets. I fumbled for my lighter, desperate to reignite the fire, but the kindling wouldn't catch. The flame guttered out, as though the air itself refused to burn. Then, my tent collapsed behind me with a sickening crunch, like it had been crushed by invisible hands. I backed away, feeling the ground shift beneath me, pulsing like something alive. My legs buckled, sending me sprawling into the dirt. The whispers surged into laughter, mocking, cruel, and deafening. Suddenly, all went silent. My ears rang in the absence of sound. That's when I saw it at the edge of the clearing, the faint outline of something impossibly tall and motionless. My flashlight flickered over the figure, revealing nothing but its shadow, which lingered long after I turned away. The whispers guided me, pulling me deeper into the forest. The trees thickened around me, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. My body moved as though on strings, each step unbidden, every nerve screaming at me to turn back. Then I saw it, a massive, gnarled tree towering above the rest. Its bark was riddled with hollow knots, each resembling a staring, lidless eye. The longer I looked, the more I swore the knots moved, shifting their gaze to follow me. The whispers crescendoed, urging me closer. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the bark. The moment my fingers made contact, a searing pain shot through my skull, and the world dissolved into chaos. Flashes of images assaulted me, campers torn apart, blood soaking the forest floor, tense, shredded like paper. Each victim stared skyward with empty eyes, their faces twisted and frozen. Screams. The shadow figure stood over them, its featureless head cocked in curiosity. And then I saw myself. I was lying on the ground, lifeless, my own eyes fixed on the starless sky. My body was motionless, but my lips were moving, whispering the same guttural words I'd heard all night. I jerked back from the tree, gasping. When I opened my eyes, fresh carvings appeared on the full bark. You belong to us now, the words pulsed faintly, glowing with an unholy light. Near the base of the tree, my foot struck something solid. I looked down to find a weathered Journal, its cover cracked with age. Flipping it open, I saw pages filled with frantic, looping handwriting. The entries were signed by someone named Mark. The words mirrored my nightmare. The stars disappeared, the whispers won't stop, the forest won't let me leave. Mark described everything: the carvings, the shadows, the relentless feeling of being watched. He'd tried to escape but always ended up back at the tree. His final entry sent ice through my veins. If you're reading this, you're already marked. The forest owns you now. I looked up, the journal slipping from my hands. The shadowy figures were back, standing in a loose circle around the clearing. Their limbs were too long, their heads tilting unnaturally as if observing me. Featureless and silent, they didn't move closer. They didn't have to. My throat tightened as the realization settled in: there was no escape. But then an idea clawed its way into my mind. Mark's journal hinted at the symbols and objects, anchoring the curse. If I destroyed them, maybe I could break free. I stumbled back to my camp, shaking with adrenaline. The spiral of rocks, the carved tree, the journal, all of it was tied to the nightmare. I had to destroy it. Grabbing a branch, I fashioned a crude torch and set the spiral ablaze. The fire roared, unnaturally fast, the flames twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The whispers turned into screams, filling the air with a sound so piercing I thought my skull would split. The shadow figures surged forward, their elongated limbs reaching for me. But I wasn't done. I turned to the tree, slamming the torch against its bark. The fire took hold, the hollow eyes, weeping thick, black sap that stank of decay. The figures paused, their heads snapping toward the flames as if in agony. The forest trembled, the ground beneath me convulsing violently. A guttural roar erupted, not from the figures, but from the tree itself, as though the ancient wood was alive and in pain. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as the sound grew unbearable. The figures closed in again, their hands inches from my face, but they didn't touch me. Instead, they dissolved into smoke, fading into the starless void. When the last shadow vanished, the fire sputtered and died. I stood alone in the clearing, the tree reduced to a smoldering stump. I staggered into the clearing where I'd first pitched my tent, gasping for air as dawn broke faintly over the horizon. The sky was lighter, yes, but it wasn't the sky I remembered. No stars, no sun, just a dim, pale gray that seemed to mock the concept of morning. I turned back toward the forest, expecting to see smoke rising from the smoldering stump of the cursed tree. But the forest stood pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. The tree of eyes loomed in the distance, its hollow knots staring straight at me. My chest tightened. It wasn't possible. I'd burned it down. My phone buzzed in my pocket, its sudden vibration startling me so badly I almost dropped it. Trembling, I unlocked the screen. The gallery was open. Dozens of photos filled the screen, all taken in the last few hours. The images were of me, but not from any angle I could have captured. I saw myself running, screaming, staring at the burning tree. In one photo, I was standing among the shadowy figures, my face turned toward the camera. I was smiling. A cold realization settled in my gut. I had no memory of taking those photos or standing with them. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. This time they weren't coming from the forest. They were inside my head. You can never leave. I made it home somehow, though I don't remember the drive. The house felt wrong, unfamiliar. The walls were too quiet, the air too still. That night, I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The stars never came back. The darkness. Outside my window wasn't natural, it was alive, pulsing with unseen movement. When I finally dared to close my eyes, I heard it whisper. It wasn't in my head this time. It was right next to me, soft and guttural. Welcome home. I jolted upright, my throat tight with fear. On the wooden frame of my bed, glowing faintly in the darkness, was the spiral symbol from the forest. It pulsed once, then faded. I stared at it for hours, unable to move, until the whispers outside grew louder. They weren't just for me anymore, they were spreading, seeping into the world beyond my window. The forest didn't let me leave. Not really. It came with me. Now the question is, will it come for you next? Check the sky tonight. If the stars disappear, it's already begun. Dare to share this story, but remember, every retelling brings it closer. Are you sure? You're alone as you finish this? Or is something already watching? Waiting? At first I thought the rule was ridiculous. Why would locking my doors matter? But the night I defied it, something came. The pounding started at midnight, slow and deliberate, followed by a voice whispering my name from the other side. That's when I realized this town's rule isn't about safety, it's about survival. When I drove into Ridgeway, the town felt like a storybook come to life. Neatly trimmed hedges, bright flowers lining the streets, and houses with porches straight out of a postcard. It seemed like the perfect place to start over. I'd rented a cozy little house on the edge of town. The realtor, who never stayed long when she showed me the property, had called it charming. I didn't notice the subtle tension in her voice until later. On my first day, my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, stopped by with a basket of homemade bread. She was warm, friendly, the kind of person who'd probably been baking pies before I was born. After some small talk, she said, "Oh, one more thing, never lock your doors at night." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You'll see," she said, her voice soft but insistent. That first night I locked my doors anyway. Why wouldn't I? The house felt cozy enough, though. A little too quiet. No hum of distant traffic, no chirping crickets, just silence so thick it felt unnatural. I told myself it was just the calm of the countryside. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just outside, watching. The next morning, Mrs. Hargrove came over again. She didn't even wait for pleasantries before asking, "Did you lock your doors last night?" I hesitated, then nodded. "It's a habit. I don't feel safe leaving them open." Her expression darkened. She leaned closer, her voice low. "Don't do it again. I'm serious. Not safe." Safe from what I asked. Half joking. She straightened, her face unreadable. "You'll see." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, I locked my doors again. I told myself her warning was just small-town superstition. At midnight, the knocking started. It was soft at first. 3 gentle knocks, like someone testing if I was home. I sat up, my heart racing, staring at the bedroom door. "Who's there?" my voice cracked. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the scratching. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. I threw the covers off and grabbed my phone. The screen wouldn't light up. My flashlight won't turn on either. The knocking started again, louder this time. My hands trembled as I pressed my ear to the door. That's when I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. "Alex." I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The doorknob rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I stood frozen, every muscle locked in fear. Finally, I mustered the courage to fling the door open. The hallway was empty. The air felt wrong, thicker, colder. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short gasps. When I looked down, I noticed faint scratch marks on the inside of the door, as though something had been trying to claw its way in. The next morning, I practically ran to Mrs. Hargrove's house. She opened the door with a knowing look, like she'd been expecting me. I told her everything, the knocking, the voice, the scratches. She didn't look surprised. "I warned you," she said simply. I demanded answers, and after a long silence, she finally relented. She told me about the wanderer, a figure from the town's past. Decades ago, people who locked their doors at night would vanish without a trace. Those who left their doors open might survive, but not without consequence. The doors aren't meant to keep things out, she said, her voice trembling. They're meant to let the night pass through. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just a story, but the memory of that voice whispering my name was too real. I left my door unlocked that night, convinced it would keep me safe. At first, the house was silent. I was almost starting to feel foolish for believing the superstition. But then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob slammed across the room with enough force to splinter the wood. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The whispers returned, louder this time. They didn't come from the door. They circled the house, moving room to room, as if something was inside with me. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, flickering and shifting even though the lights were off. By morning, I found a symbol etched into the inside of my door, a jagged spiral that pulsed faintly, as though it was alive. That was when I realized the rule wasn't just about letting the night pass. It was about keeping whatever it was from finding you. I found the cabin just before sunset, hidden behind a wall of dense trees at the edge of town. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the space itself didn't want me there. The walls were covered in spirals, scratched deep into the wood. Some were jagged, chaotic, while others were eerily precise. Between them were phrases etched over and over: never lock. The door it watches, it waits. My flashlight flickered, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move even when I stood still. On a table in the center of the room lay a tattered journal, its cover stained and warped. I flipped through it, each page filled with frantic, looping handwriting. One entry stopped me cold. The door traps it inside. If you lock it, you invite it into your home. Don't lock the door. The room grew colder still, my breath misting in the air. The shadows along the walls stretched, unnaturally, their edges sharpening into distorted shapes. Then I heard it again, the voice. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. You shouldn't have come here. The shadows lunged toward me, and the journal slammed shut. I bolted out of the cabin, my flashlight clattering to the ground behind me. As I ran, the spirals burned into my mind, their shapes pulsing with a sinister rhythm. The voice followed me, whispering my name, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. When I stumbled back into town, it was unrecognizable. The streets were empty, and every door was locked tight. Not just shut, but barricaded planks, nailed across windows, locks glinting in the faint moonlight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by my ragged breaths and the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. I sprinted toward my house, my only thought to get inside, to feel some semblance of safety. But when I reached the door, it was locked. From the inside, panic surged through me. I pounded on the wood, my fists aching with the force. Let me in, I screamed. The porch light flickered, casting warped shadows across the walls. The door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was me. At least it looked like me. But its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. Its smile stretched too wide, the edges curling unnaturally. Welcome home, it said in my voice, though the tone was wrong, layered, echoing, and far too deep. I stumbled back as it stepped closer, the spiral symbol glowing faintly on the door behind it. Before I could react, it slammed the door shut. The sound reverberated through the empty street, followed by a final whisper, "You're mine now." I turned to run, but the town had disappeared. The street, the houses, the trees all replaced by an endless darkness. And somewhere in that void, the voice laughed. I woke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as if it had never stopped pounding from the night before. For a fleeting moment, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. The cabin, the whispers, the thing that wore my face, it couldn't have been real. But the room was wrong. The shadows were darker, denser, almost liquid in the corners. The air felt heavy, humming with an energy that pricked my skin. My eyes fell on the door to my bedroom. It was ajar, swinging slightly as though it had just been opened. I crept toward it, my pulse thundering in my ears. Beyond the door, the hallway stretched, unnaturally long, twisting at angles that shouldn't have existed. Faint whispers echoed from somewhere deep within the house, growing louder with each step I took. When I reached the front door, I froze. The spiral symbol was carved deeply into the wood, glowing faintly, its edges pulsating like a heartbeat. My fingers hovered over it, and for a moment, I felt it pulse beneath my hand, alive and watching. Stepping outside, the world was not the town I knew. The streets were lined with my neighbors, each standing perfectly still in their doorways. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, all of them staring directly at me. I turned back toward my house. In the upstairs window, a figure stood, a silhouette identical to mine except for the eyes. They glowed with the same faint light as the spiral. The thing smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch of its lips. That night, the whispers didn't stay outside. They were in the walls, the floor, my mind. I didn't lock the door. I couldn't. By morning, I was gone. Now Ridgeway waits for its next resident. If you've read this far, check your doors tonight. Did you leave them unlocked? Can you hear the whispers yet? Share this story, but be warned with every retelling. The rule grows closer to you. You sure you're alone as you finish reading? Or is something already watching from the shadows? The music box sat silent every time I watched it, its ornate design giving no hint of life. But when I left the room, the haunting melody would drift through the house, soft and deliberate. Last night, as I lay in bed, the tune changed. It started humming my name. The attic smelled of mildew and dust, thick enough to cling to my skin as I shuffled through my grandmother's belongings. Her house had always been a mystery to me. I'd only visited a handful of times as a child, but I remembered the feeling it gave me, like every shadow held a secret. As I sifted through old boxes, I found the music box nestled in a corner beneath a pile of moth-eaten linens. It was smaller than I expected, no bigger than a hardcover book, yet oddly heavy. The wood was dark and smooth, carved with strange patterns, tiny, twisted figures that seemed to dance and writhe. I tried to wind the rusted key, but it wouldn't budge. The lid was stuck too, sealed as if it hadn't been opened in years. Still, it felt significant, important somehow. I didn't know why, but I brought it home with me, thinking it would be a unique keepsake. That night, I placed the box on my nightstand, its carvings catching the dim glow of the lamp. As I got into bed, I could have sworn the room grew quieter, like all the sounds had been absorbed into the air. It was unsettling, but I dismissed it. It wasn't until I turned off the light and lay in the dark that I heard it. A faint melody drifted through the room, soft and haunting. My breath caught, and I sat up, staring at the music box. It was still closed, the key unmoved. The melody followed me the next day. I couldn't shake it. That soft, lilting tune that seemed to hum in the back of my mind. At first I thought I was imagining it, a lingering echo from the night before. But when I left the room, the music grew louder, more deliberate, as if it was calling to me. I returned to the living room, and the sound stopped. The box sat on the coffee table, innocent and still. My pulse quickened as I reached for it. The wood was warm to the touch, almost alive. I turned it over in my hands, examining every detail. The carvings were intricate, each figure frozen mid-motion, their faces distorted into vague expressions of fear or agony. I tried winding the key again, but it was stuck fast. Frustrated, I set it back on the table and left the room. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the melody began again. It was beautiful, haunting, and wrong. This time I stood frozen, listening. It wasn't random, it was purposeful, like a lullaby meant for someone specific. When I walked back into the room, the melody stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. That night, as I lay in bed, the music returned, drifting through the house like a ghost. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown it out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. The next morning, I woke to a strange smell, faint and acrid, like burning wood. The air in the living room was heavy, almost suffocating, as though the house had been holding its breath. The music box sat where I'd left it, but something was different. The carvings seemed sharper, the figures more defined. One of them, a tiny figure on the corner, appeared to be looking straight at me. I told myself it was my imagination, that I hadn't noticed the details before. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me all day. As the week went on, the melody grew louder, more insistent. It began playing even when I was in the same room, stopping only when I touched the box. Each time it played, the tune seemed to shift slightly, its notes bending and twisting into something unfamiliar. One night, I left my phone recording in the living room while I went to bed. When I played it back, the next morning, my blood ran cold. The melody wasn't just playing, it was humming. And beneath the hum, I heard a faint whisper, "Claire." The melody had a strange familiarity now, as if I'd heard it before. One evening, as I sat listening, it hit me. The tune was almost identical to a song my grandmother used to hum when I was little. But this version was slower, distorted, like a warped memory brought back to life. The realization left me breathless. I searched through old photo albums, desperate for any clue. I found a picture of my grandmother holding the music box. Her face was pale, her expression tight, as if she didn't want to touch it. On the back of the photo were the words, "Never leave it alone." I stared at the message, my hands trembling. What did she mean? Why would she keep something so clearly dangerous? That night, I couldn't sleep. The music box sat on the table in the corner, its presence oppressive. At midnight, the melody started again, but this time it was different. The notes stretched, warped into long, dissonant tones. The tune twisted and shifted, forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. It was humming my name. By now, I was afraid to touch the box. It seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, as if it was alive. Tipia. One morning, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The tiny figures on the box had changed. They weren't just frozen in motion anymore, they were moving. Their heads had turned slightly, their hollow faces now angled toward me. I stared at the box, my heart hammering in my chest. I was certain the figures had been facing outward before, their poses locked in a dance. Now, they looked directly at me, their expressions twisted into grotesque parodies of human faces. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself I'd been mistaken. But that night I woke to find the box sitting on the floor beside my bed. I hadn't moved it. The lid was slightly ajar, the melody drifting out softly, almost soothing, until I realized the figures were gone. The carvings had vanished, leaving the wood bare. I searched the room, panic rising in my throat, but the figures were nowhere to be found. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw something shift, a faint shadow that didn't belong. And in the silence that followed, I heard it again, Claire. The antique dealer's warning. The music box sat on the passenger seat as I drove to the antique dealer, the melody echoing faintly in the back of my mind like a song I couldn't shake. I didn't dare glance at it. I kept my eyes on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The dealer's shop was cramped and musty, filled with shelves of curiosities and relics. He was an older man, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, but his demeanor changed the moment he saw the box. His eyes widened, and he stepped back, nearly knocking over a rack. I have old maps. Where did you get that? He whispered. I told him about my grandmother's attic, how it seemed ordinary until it began playing by itself. He shook his head violently. You shouldn't have brought it here. You shouldn't have touched it. He wouldn't touch it either. Instead, he told me its name, the Siren's Lament, crafted centuries ago. It was said to be cursed, an object capable of trapping the souls of those who listened to, belong to its song. He pointed to the figures carved along its edges. Each one of them is a victim, he said, his voice barely audible. I asked how to get rid of it. He simply shook his head. It won't let you. It chooses who it wants. As I turned to leave, desperate and shaken, the melody began playing again, soft, mocking. When I got back to the car, the box was no longer in the passenger seat. It was waiting for me, on the dashboard. I tried everything to rid myself of it. I left it at the shop, abandoned it at a park, even threw it into the river. But every time I found it waiting for me at home. It began playing at odd hours, its tune shifting to something darker, more discordant. The figures on the box grew more lifelike with each passing day, their carved faces now twisted into expressions of pain and fear. One night, I woke to find the music box sitting on my chest. The melody was louder than ever. And when I looked down, one of the figures had turned into a perfect replica of my own face. I screamed and threw it across the room. But it didn't break. The tune kept playing, the notes, warping and twisting into a sound that felt like nails scraping against my skull. I knew then that I couldn't escape it. The carvings on the box grew more intricate, the spirals around the figures almost hypnotic. One morning I found words scratched into the lid, play the song. I resisted for as long as I could, but the box wouldn't let me ignore it. Its melody became a constant hum in the back of my mind, invading every thought. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Finally, in desperation, I wound the key. The lid creaked open, and the melody that poured out was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was haunting, otherworldly, each note pulling me deeper into something I couldn't understand. The carved figures began to move, their tiny hands reaching outward. One by one, they fell to the floor, their bodies twisting and growing. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes watching as the melody grew louder. In the silence that followed, I heard my grandmother's voice, faint and trembling. It's too late. Claire, run. I fled, but the music followed me. It was in the wind, the creak of the floorboards, the rhythm of my own heartbeat. When I finally stopped running, I realized the box was in my hands again. It felt heavier, and the carvings had changed. My figure was now fully formed, staring back at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. The tune slowed, warping into something almost unrecognizable, and then the lid snapped shut. I didn't think so. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys, sprinted to the car, and drove without looking back. My house, the music box, the shadows, I left it all behind. Or so I thought. The melody started just as I hit the highway, faint at first, rising above the hum of the engine. I turned off the radio, my hands gripping the wheel as the haunting tune filled the car. It wasn't coming from the speakers. I glanced at the passenger seat. The music box sat there, perfectly still, as though it had been waiting. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop on the shoulder. Heart pounding, I threw open the door, grabbed the box, and hurled it into the trees. It tumbled out of sight, its melody trailing off like a dying breath. But when I climbed back into the car, it was there again, sitting on the dashboard. It was heavier now. The wood looked darker, the carvings more detailed. My breath hitched as I noticed a new figure etched along the lid. Its face was unmistakable. It was me. I don't know how I got back to the house. I don't even remember driving home. But the next thing I knew, I was standing in the living room, the music box cradled in my hands. Its melody was softer now, almost soothing, as if it knew it had won. I tried to leave again, but the door wouldn't open. The windows were locked, the air inside, growing thick and oppressive. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements matching the rhythm of the tune. Then I saw them, the carved figures from the box. They were no longer etched into the wood. They stood in the corners of the room, full-sized and unmoving, their hollow eyes fixed on me. One by one, they began to hum the melody, their voices blending with the song from the box. And then, as the shadows closed in, I realized something. The music wasn't following me. It wasn't haunting me. It was pulling me in. The next morning, my house was silent. No one answered when neighbors knocked on the door. Inside, everything was untouched, except for the music box sitting on the coffee table. The lid was closed, the carvings on the wood just as intricate as before. But now, there was one more figure etched along the edge. It was smiling. If you ever hear a song playing when no one else is around, don't follow it. Don't touch it. And whatever you do, don't let it know your name. Share this story, but be warned, every retelling draws it closer to you. Are you sure the music hasn't started for you yet? Or is it already humming in the shadows, waiting for you to listen?